Hello everyone, this is Anne from Lolli and Grace, and today I want to talk about not so much what is on the front of the hoop, but more so about what ends up being on the back of the hoop. Specifically, what I'm talking about is knots. In other words, knots that you would put in the end of your thread when you are getting your thread ready to stitch. So in other words, that little dude right there, as well as knots that you put on the back of the hoop when you're finished with a section of stitching, and how to end your thread so that it doesn't get in the way of the rest of your stitching. So let me say just briefly that although this is the method that I'm going to show you, this is not the only method for beginning and ending your stitching, and I'm certainly not trying to say that it's the only right method. This is just the way that I do it pretty much all of the time, and I've just found it to be very quick and efficient and secure, especially if you were, on hoops. It's not quite as much because they're for display, but if you're working on clothing or something like that, you might need your threads to be a little bit more secure. But this is just, I like this method, and I've got my routine down, and it's really simple. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some specific little tips that will help make it quick and easy and efficient for you too, hopefully. The first thing to learn is how to put a knot in the end of your thread. So I have 3 strands here. I've already stripped these threads, and if you don't know what stripping is, it's a method of separating the strands of thread out of the 6 strands of like DMC 6-stranded cotton embroidery thread. That's what this is. So I have 3 strands here, but this method will work for any number of strands from 1 strand to 6 strands. So there's the end. I've already have it on my needle on this end. So I'm going to hold the end of the thread with this hand. I'm going to place the needle behind the thread, and then I'm going to hold it with my thumb and forefinger like that. So the thread is on top, the needle's underneath. I'm going to slide that so I don't have just a little bit showing. And now I'm going to wrap this thread around the needle. How many times you wrap it depends on the number of strands you have. If I am using 3 strands and I have a nice tight weave of cotton right here, I can get away with wrapping it 1 time. If I was doing 1 strand, I might wrap it 2 or 3 times because the knot's going to be smaller. Or if I was using a more open, loose, like linen, depending on how soft it was and how far apart the weave was. Even with 3 strands, I might wrap once or twice, maybe 2 or 3 times. But generally for 3 strands, I can just wrap 1 time. So now I will switch and I will hold that wrap with the other hand. Now I don't want this wrap to be too tight because I will not be able to do this next part. I'm going to push the needle through. I'm holding it loosely with these 2 fingers, and I'm going to just pull it right through until I get to the end. And there is my knot. So this is called a quilter's knot. Well, let me finish up. One last thing to do is I now take my embroidery scissors, my nice little sharp embroidery scissors, and I'm going to trim that off very close to the knot. The reason I do that is because if I left these little tails, when I bring it up through the fabric and I go to stitch around it, those little long tails might get pulled up through the fabric as I'm stitching around this area. So if I trim them off short like that, it's not going to come untied because you don't want to cut, right up against the knot. Give just a little teensy bit of length there, but that's not enough length to get caught up in the later stitches. Like I said, this is called a quilter's knot. Super simple to do. Makes a great knot first time, every time. The knot that I used to do for years and years is the kind where you take the thread and you wrap it around your finger and then you twist it off until you get a certain, it kind of twists up on itself, and then you pull it. So that gets you a knot as well. But I found the problem with that is, like in the winter, if my hands are dry, I would do this and I would twist and I just could never get it to twist off, and sometimes it would make a knot and sometimes it wouldn't. And I just like, if I'm going to do something over and over and over and over, like putting a knot in the end of many, many threads, I want it to work quickly and easily the first time I try it. So even though that knot worked, the quilter's knot, let me show that to you one more time. Cut that one off. Let me show you the quilter's knot one more time. So I usually start right here and I lay the thread on top of the needle, pull it down so I have just a little bit of a tail right there, hold it with this hand. I'm going to wrap with this hand. How many times you wrap depends on how many strands of thread. Fewer strands, 1 or 2 strands, you can maybe want to wrap 2 or 3 times. More strands, 3 to 4, 5, 6 strands, maybe you only need to wrap once, but I've wrapped one time. I'm going to transfer it over to that hand. I did not wrap too tightly so that when I push the needle through and pull it through like this, it just glides right through and I have a perfect little knot. Now I will take the end of that. And when I trim this, I don't trim it over my work. I trim it over to the side on my table so that these little tails will not, if I'm stitching, I would not trim over my work. But I'm trimming it right here so that you can see it. And so that's the knot in the end of my thread. So that is the quickest, easiest way to get a knot for when you were starting your thread. Now that we have the knot in the end of the thread, all you have to do is start stitching. So just pull that thread all the way through and the knot will stop the thread. And from here on, you really just can forget about it. There's only one time where it might get in your way, and that is if you are doing satin stitching, where if you make a stitch and then you're going to come back down and you're going to come up right next to that knot. You know, you're going to do a series of stitches right next to each other, and so the next stitch would be, you're going to have to bring your needle up really super close. Sometimes that knot is sort of in your way, so on the back, I just take my finger and I just pull that knot out of the way while I just kind of push up and pull that knot over to the side so that when I put that needle in right next to it, the knot is out of the way, and then I can continue on with whatever stitching I'm doing. But other than that, it really just stays out of your way. And for some of the reasons I like this method of using the knot is that it doesn't use up a lot of thread, and you don't have to worry about, stitching over the thread on the back to catch it, to secure it. And I mentioned not having to use a lot of thread. Sometimes this thread is not that expensive, but if you're using silk thread, if you are like coming up over here and then you're gonna come anyway, silk thread is so expensive. This really uses very little thread, so it's an efficient way to use your thread, to save your thread if it's expensive. So let's say now that we are done stitching and we are ready to finish out this section, or you've used up all your thread, and now it's time to knot it on the back. Let me flip this over and I will show you how that works. And here we are on the back. And if you have a lot of stitching, you could, to end your thread, you could just, run several stitches underneath. But sometimes those stitches might work their way loose. And so what you want to do, or what I always do, is I tie a knot very, very close to the fabric. And to accomplish that, what you do is you're going to hold it with your other hand, and you want the thread to be on top, in other words, not like this, but like this. And then I just hold it tight right here, and then I just put my needle underneath. I pull it, and I'm still holding it tight right there, so that when I pull that, where it's twisted, right, it goes through the other thread, it stays right next to the fabric. So I can pull it through, but what I then do is sometimes see how right there the knot is way up high on the thread. Just pull it down so that it's all the way against the fabric. Then I put a fingernail against that and I pull. So now that knot is right up against the fabric. And I usually only need to knot it once. And if I do have a lot of stitching nearby, I mean, you could just right now, just trim it off really close. But to give myself a little bit of extra thread so I'm not trimming way close to that knot, which could conceivably, as you continue to work on the hoop and you're putting your fingers on the back and doing a lot of work, it could conceivably maybe sort of come untied. So I will, if I have got stitching nearby, I will run a couple of stitches, and so that gives me, quarter of an inch or so. And now I do trim it really close. And I trim it close for the same reason that I trimmed the tail end of the knot close, because if I were to leave, along, let's just say that I've made my knot. If I were to leave, if I were to trim it and leave a long tail, same thing. This tail, when I'm stitching later on, I could pull these threads up to the front, and that's just a hassle. So let me show you one more time how to do that knot up against the fabric. So let me get this. So I made another knot in the end of my thread. I'm going to trim it off. So I know I'm working from the back here. So anyway, let's just say I've made a stitch. And I'm ready to finish off my thread. Hold it like this. Whoops. Hold it like this. Just put that needle under. Pull that thread so that it's tight against the fabric. If it does slip up like that, just work it back down so that it's right up against that fabric right there. And then just move over, put your fingernail on it, and pull until you have a knot right up there close to the fabric. And then, like I said, run it under some stitching right around it to give yourself a little bit of extra, and then snip it really close to the fabric. So that is all you need to do to put a knot at the beginning and a knot at the end. And let me show you on the back of this piece. A lot of people, some people really are really intense about having their backs look really neat, and some people think that knots don't look neat. It can look very neat. And here is one. I know you're kind of looking around the gathered fabric right here, but if you'll see, can you see all of those knots? They leave little bitty fuzzies, and that's okay, but they're short enough that, like I said, they're not going to get trapped. They're not going to get pulled up with your other stitching. So this one has a lot of satin stitching on it, but all those little knots are right there, so the back looks really neat. The other thing about cutting them really short is on white fabric like this. If you leave long tails, other than getting pulled up through to the front with your other stitching, if you have white fabric and you have a long tail of like black thread, it could show on the front, which is, the same reason you don't go from like this section of stitching, stretch it all the way over here, because that black thread will show through on white fabric. So anyway, that is the tutorial for how to stop and start your stitching with knots. I hope you found it helpful, and I will see you next time.